right after I graduated from high school, one of the things, the culture of Flint, Detroit, the very few cities that were like this, Rust Belt cities really, there were jobs that were available for people who didn't, a high school degree wasn't even required, and you made a very good living. You could make a respectable wage, you could raise a family very well on what you earned. And right out of high school, I told my parents that I was through with school. I didn't want to go to college anymore. I wanted to start working in the factory and make some money. I wanted to buy a car is what it was mostly. So I went to the factory, started working there. I would work nights. I'd work days and go to school nights. And that was actually the start of my writing career too, because I would write during breaks. Not thinking of it as a career or anything, but I found out that as long as I would sit down there and write, time would go by really quickly for me. I wouldn't think about the factory. And the job I was on, we doubled up, which means instead of doing every other job like we were supposed to, my friend would do 30 in a row and then I'd do another 30. So I was getting a half hour out of every hour to sit down and write, and it made a big difference. And it's also probably one of the reasons that quality of American cars isn't so good. As I said earlier, I really hated working in the factory. The thrill of being in there and getting that big fat check wore off very quickly. I would get up in the morning, 5 o'clock. I worked first shift, so I had to be there at 6, and that's a habit that I've still got. I can't not wake up at 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock, I'm wide awake. I'd go to work, punch in, and then the whistle blows, and you're doing the same thing hour after hour after hour. And the only thing that made it tolerable were the other fellas that I worked with in the factory. And I say fellas because it was all guys, because we worked in the body shop on the door line. It was a very physical job, a very tough physical job. The doors weighed 50 to 80 pounds, very heavy. You had to hang 300 of them a day. And at that time, they weren't letting women work in the body shop. And then some women complained that they wanted to be in there too. And what they would do is they would put them on the door line because they knew it was a rough, tough job, and that a lot of men couldn't do it, so they figured that the women couldn't either. But a couple women stuck it out. But I really hated being in there. It's the only thing in my life that I've ever had any kind of semi-hallucinations. I can remember waking up in the middle of the night and feeling my bed going along at the speed of the line and thinking, I gotta get out of here. Or I can remember one time, and I know I was awake, and I looked in the corner of the room, and the door hanging fixture was hanging from the corner of my room. And I said, okay, this is a nightmare, wake up, and it was still there. So it took a long time for me to get away from that for a couple reasons. One, the culture of Flint was such that once you're in the factory, you were pretty well set. You didn't have to worry about much of anything. Health care was great. Your wages were good. As long as you went to work and took care of business, everything was fine. Another reason was, as my mother had told me when I first went in, she said, no, I don't want you to go in there. You'll start buying things. You'll get trapped in there. I started buying things. I bought that 1973 Camaro, brand new Camaro. I was shocked that the payments were $86 a month, but that's what it was back then. And I spent there 13 years in there before I finally got the courage up to leave and to try something else. My writing career has really been kind of unusual. I think most times authors are driven people because you really have to be focused and you have to be driven because there's a lot of rejection involved. When you're first starting to write, you might have a skill, you might have a story to tell, but it's really hard to put everything together and get it down into one thing. And so most of the time writers really just work at it and are very focused and can take the rejection and learn from it. I never really thought of myself as a writer. It wasn't until I was in my 40s that I sent the first book in. So I think I had a different perspective on it. And I'm not good with rejection. You tell me something's bad, I'll believe you. And with The Watsons Go to Birmingham, which was the first book I wrote, I had to enter contests, and I sent it to Little Brown, and it was rejected. And I'd also sent it to Delacorte's first young adult fiction contest. And it didn't win the contest, but they published it anyway. And if they had rejected it, that would have been it. I never would have written another book because, as I said, you Tell me twice it's no good, I'll believe you. The publication of The Watsons Go to Birmingham, 1963, made a real difference in my life, complete difference in my life. For the first time, I was doing something that I enjoyed doing. I was successful at it. I was able to, with the success came financial success too. So I was able to buy things that before I wasn't able to buy. And I discovered that there's just nothing in the world like doing something that you enjoy and being able to make a living at it. So The Watsons Go to Birmingham has, I've said this a lot of times, has always been my favorite book. One of the reasons was it got me, I was working in a warehouse at the time, and because of that book I don't work in a warehouse anymore. One of the ways I get through life is by having very low expectations. That way you don't get nasty surprises. So when the book did well and it started to win awards, I go into kind of a shell, I think, and it's great to hear these things, but I don't really buy them. And I think that's a good protective mechanism, because bad things that you hear as well, you don't really buy them. You realize, okay, that's good to hear something like that. I didn't really realize how well the Watsons was doing, because you're with your royalty periods, you're like a year behind from what the sales are. So it wasn't until then, but I thought I was doing really well when I got a call from a principal in Michigan who had read the book, and I was working in a warehouse unloading trucks at the time, and he said that he wanted me to come speak. And I thought, okay, you want me to come speak? And he said, and we don't have a lot of money to pay you. I thought, okay, $20, I'll be there. But he said, we have $300. And I remember almost dropping the phone, $300? I said, yeah, okay, I'll be there. Because I was making $300 a week in the warehouse. One of the great joys of writing for me is not knowing where the story is going to go, or even having a concept of where it's going to go and being told halfway through that's not what happened. This is what happened. I know in the book that I just finished, Elijah of Buxton, I wrote the last chapter first. And it changed over time. Once I got to know the character, I realized that things that happened in the chapter, as I had written it at first, didn't work out, and the story changed. But no, I never know where the story is going to go. I never know who's going to be in it. Originally, in Bud Not Buddy, I thought that I would tell a story about my grandfather as a 10-year-old boy. Back during the 1930s, he actually had a band called Herman Curtis and the Dusky Devastators of the Depression. Thought it was the coolest name in the world. I wanted to write something about it. Started to write, and thinking that the boy would be my grandfather. Turns out it was this 10-year-old orphan named Bud. My grandfather was in the story still, but he was a crusty old musician. So you never know, and that's one of the real delights of telling a story. And it makes you wonder how many stories are in there that, if I would sit down and really apply myself, how many other stories would come out like that? Because it's great entertainment. When I'm writing, I have a lot of fun. I'm laughing. Some of the time I'm crying. I'm a real sight to watch when I'm writing. I have 4 rules for young people who want to be writers. And the first rule that I have is, and you got to follow these, rule number 1 is to write every day, because writing's like anything else that you do. The more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. Rule number 2, have fun with your writing, because as a writer, you're really a god. You can create people, you can destroy people, you can speed time up, you can slow time down. Have fun with that. It's a fun thing to do. Rule number 3, particularly for young people, be patient with yourself, because writing is one of the few arts where there are no prodigies. You don't have kids writing really, really good books. Writing is something that you have to live, and you have to learn how to express yourself. That takes time, and it takes practice. And rule number 4, ignore all rules. And what I mean by that is, once you learn the proper way to construct a story and learn how to write, develop your own style. Make it interesting. That's what makes anything interesting, when somebody does something a little differently. And that was one of the things that I think that Mrs. Harris in 11th grade encouraged me to do. My stories were never traditional in the form of, I remember writing a story about a fly once, and she just was delighted about this story about a fly. And I thought, oh, that's, I just kind of wrote that just for having fun, and here she liked that. And that gave me encouragement. So students and teachers both, I think, need to enjoy what they're doing with their writing. Make it something that is enjoyable. I think that's the most important thing. Have fun with it. When we lived in Flint a long time ago, there was a friend of my father's who was blind, and every Saturday he would come down. We lived in a little alleyway, and we could hear him tapping his cane down the alleyway. And the Curtis kids were so excited because Mr. Wesley would always bring us Verner's ginger ale and a bag of potato chips. And so I started to write a story about a little boy whose father had a mysterious friend who gave him the unusual piece of money that he wasn't quite sure if it was real or not, because it had a 1 with 15 zeros, which is $2 quadrillion. And instead of having a picture of a dead American president on it, it had a picture of James Brown. So the young man thought, well, maybe this isn't real. But Mr. Chicky's Funny Money was really kind of an escape for me from getting away from the writing the Watsons. Elijah of Buxton was the result of a desire of mine to write something about slavery. I can't think of a more difficult subject to write about, because when I write, I like to put myself in the place of the character and try to imagine what it would be like. It's not in my powers to imagine what it would be like to be a slave, to be completely dehumanized like that, and to have to surrender your humanity, really, and worse yet, to have to teach your children that that's what they have to do. So by setting Elijah in Buxton, Ontario, which is about 40 miles from Detroit in Canada, terminus of the Underground Railroad that actually did exist, and it's still there. North Buxton is still there, with 200 of the ancestors of the original settlers still living there. By setting it there, I was able to look at slavery without being actually in it. Elijah came to me differently than the other stories have, and I don't know if it's a function of me becoming a better writer, growing as a writer, learning more what I'm doing, because I haven't written many books, and I'm still feeling my way around, trying to know what to do. I'm hoping that's what the case is, that I finally got it down. I don't think so, but I think that Elijah came to me very, very easily. The story, as I said, I'd written the last chapter first. I had a lot of the characters there, everything set. Didn't turn out to be the way it ended, but once I started backtracking from that last chapter and found out more about Elijah and about the community in Buxton, some of the time there's just some things that really strike you. This book really grabbed a hold of me from the very beginning. Took a very short time to write for me. It took about 6 months to be essentially done, and that's a very short time for me. I divide my writing into 2 phases. As I said, I get up in the morning at 5 o'clock. That's my editorial time. From 5 until about 8, I take what I've written the day before and try to beat it into the form of a story. And then from about 9 until 12 is when I go to the library, and that's my creative time. And I've learned that during that time period, I just let the story go. A lot of things that I'm writing I know won't end up in the book. They don't seem to have anything to do with the story, but I've learned I just let them go, because it gives me some kind of background on what it is that I'm writing about. And I can tell during the process when I'm writing that I've got the story and I know where it's going, when the editorial part becomes much shorter than the creative part. And with Elijah, it was almost from the word go that the creative part was there, and just about everything I would write I kept and would hold on to, which was unusual. And I'm hoping, which is going to be the status quo from now on. We'll see.